Lytle was born in 1875 in Rutherford County, Tennessee. We believe that she was born in or near the town of Murfreesboro. She grew up, though, in Topeka, Kansas. Her family was a part of a millennial movement of Black Americans in the decade that we know as Reconstruction, the decades that we know as Reconstruction, that moved west to Kansas, to Missouri, in search of better lives. In Tennessee, during the 1870s, the time when Lutie was born, the Ku Klux Klan raided houses, they skinned people alive, they burned homes, churches, schools, they divested freedmen of their lands, and they performed lynchings. The movement of this family was one of thousands of other families out of Tennessee and out of the American South into the West. Lytle's family settled in Topeka, Kansas in the early 1880s, and she was educated in the schools of Topeka. Lutie's parents, John and Molly, we believe were themselves formerly enslaved. Molly did not work outside the home. John is listed in the census as having been a barber. We know that in the 1800s, in the South at least, barbering was an almost exclusively Black occupation. Black men worked as barbers primarily in the service of a white clientele. John Lytle, Lutie's father, was a barber who did this work. Later, he would use his money from barbering to start his own business, an entrepreneurial venture, if you will. He became what we call a huckster. He sold fruits, vegetables, and household goods and products out of the back of a truck. In Topeka, Lutie actually attended public schools. In the 1880s, Topeka was one of the few places where segregation was not yet lawful. So Lutie was educated in an integrated school system in 1880s Topeka. And we know what kind of student she was because Lutie Lytle made the newspaper even before she was a teenager. We know that when she was 9 or 10, an article was written about how she was excelling in her studies and how everyone in the area was so proud of her for her oratorical skills and for her composition skills. Lutie became interested in law actually from her work with the Black press. So as a teenager, she worked as what we call a compositor and an editor for one of the leading Black newspapers in the state of Kansas, the Kansas Blackman. This Kansas Blackman newspaper, I'm pronouncing it Blackman, it's spelled Black Man. The Kansas Blackman newspaper was, I think it was published in Topeka, and Lutie as a teenager, so we think that she was maybe 15 or 16, began working with the editors of the paper to put together the type that would then be run over a press to create the actual folio of the paper itself. From there, she began to write for the Kansas Blackman and eventually became an editor for the Kansas Blackman. We know that she was a prolific writer for the paper because articles were printed saying in the other press, so papers outside of the Blackman, saying that there were more people knew Lutie's words because of how her words were copied and reprinted by others than because they were associated with her and her own name. So Lutie actually attended Central Tennessee College. Central Tennessee College was a law school, a university based in Nashville. It was founded in the wake of the Civil War by a religious denomination and designed for the education of formerly enslaved folks in and around the city of Nashville. Lutie, we don't know because we don't have any records of how she became acquainted with Central Tennessee College, we do know that she traveled from Topeka to Tennessee before enrolling in college and actually worked as a school teacher there, saving money that she would then use to enroll in the law department at Central Tennessee College. Lutie wrote later in her life, after her graduation, that she became interested in law because of her work with the newspaper. At this time, the Black press was a vibrant institution in Black America. So Lutie would have been exposed to news about politics and political goings on that were affecting Black people. She would have been introduced to news of violence against Black people. She would have been introduced to news about local business successes, local entrepreneurial ventures that were started and supported by Black people in and around Kansas. And this was a way for folks throughout the U.S. to get news of what was happening in other places. So she would have been able to see during the late 1880s and the early 1890s about the divestment, the violence, the inequality, and the deaths of Black people at the hands of white mobs throughout the South. This was, in her own words, what made her interested in law. She saw law as a shield and as an opportunity for Black people to actually fully realize their citizenship rights in the United States. So in one of the interviews that she did after her graduation from law school, she indicated that she was mostly interested in law because the law was the basis of Black citizenship. And it was because of law that Black people had opportunities to be free. She also, we know, as a teenager, worked for the Kansas State Legislature, which of course, Topeka being the capital, was there in Topeka. In addition to her work at the Kansas Blackman newspaper, she also was what we call an enrolling clerk or an engrossment clerk for the Kansas State Legislature. So this is in the early 1890s. In other words, before Lutie Lytle could vote, Lutie Lytle was employed by the Kansas State Legislature. Before Lutie graduated, I think it's important to note that she was the only woman studying in the law department at Central Tennessee College. We know about the composition of the college because the college published catalogs listing the names of students and the names of faculty. There were no other women students and there were no women faculty. When she entered, she was in a small class. There were only 2 students who entered that year. And as luck would have it, Lutie graduated at the top of the class. When she graduated valedictorian of her class from Central Tennessee College, Lutie was interested in starting a law practice. So she sought admission to the bar in the state of Tennessee. She went to a local court, a local judge, seeking admittance to the Tennessee State Bar, and this judge, believing that state law forbade women from practicing law, refused to admit Lutie to the bar. It is then that Lutie reached out to a network of Black lawyers and found Josiah Settle, who was a biracial Black lawyer living in Memphis in Shelby County. He was a mentor and father figure for Ida B. Wells. Lutie reached out to Josiah Settle. Josiah Settle encouraged Lutie to travel to Memphis, and it was with Josiah Settle's help that Lutie was admitted to the bar of the state of Tennessee in Memphis, not in Nashville. At the time, she became the first woman admitted to practice law in the state of Tennessee. From there, she traveled home, back to Topeka, where she was admitted to the bar without any difficulty, becoming the first woman, again, admitted to practice law in the state of Kansas. We know that Lutie had designs on establishing a law practice. She wanted to be a lawyer. She put a call out, saying that she wanted to move to Chicago, that she thought Chicago would be a good place because it was growing. So the 1890s, Chicago is seeing a population boom, and Lutie Lytle recognizes this. So when she graduates from law school in 1897, she's thinking, let me go where the people are. So she looks to Chicago, but nobody will go into practice with her. She worries that she won't be able to build a practice on her own. She looks around in Topeka. She can't find anyone who will go into business with her. So she returns to Central Tennessee College, where she's offered a position as an instructor at the law school. At this time, this is the fall of 1898, Lutie Lytle becomes the first woman anywhere to teach at an established law school. You know, this is a good question. I don't see from Lutie's interviews in the press her mention of mentors, but I do know that she reached out to Josiah Settle, and Josiah Settle helped her get admitted to the bar. I think that's a mentoring role. I know that her father was a great mentor for her. Her father was the one who arranged for her to have a job there at the Kansas State Legislature. I think he also used his own connections to further her career as he saw fit, as he could. I wonder if Lutie knew Ida B. Wells. I imagine that she did. Now, I don't know if Ida B. Wells would have been a mentor to her necessarily, because I don't see them appearing together in the press anywhere from my own searches. But I imagine that, knowing Josiah Settle, that she would have also known Ida B. Wells. In terms of other women, we know that Lutie, as a young woman, but while she was, I think, 19, she traveled to Atlanta to participate in the Atlanta Exposition, and this large group of Black women gathered at the Atlanta Exposition as part of the Black Women's Club movement, and Lutie Lytle was present. So I think that she had relationships, she cultivated personal connections. She did all of the things that we tell our students to do today. Go out, find people who have done this work, find people who have blazed trails, and tell them what you need. She did that. And her name and her face pops up all over the place in the 1890s and early 1900s in Black America. Lutie was clear that she wanted to start a law practice. We know that she either gave up the dream of starting a law practice or deferred the dream of starting a law practice. In the early 1900s, Lutie married, and she married a lawyer who was in New York City. So she married and moved to New York. This lawyer, Al Cohen, he was older than Lutie. He was an established lawyer in the city, having attended a New York law school. Al Cohen had a commercial business practice, and he also had a civil rights practice at the turn of the century in New York City. So together, after she married him, she began to practice with Al Cohen out of his practice. Now this tactic of a woman pairing with her husband to start or pursue a legal practice is actually a common practice among Black women in the early 1900s. So Lutie was doing it in, I think, 1908, 1909, 1910. We know that Sadie Alexander did it in Philadelphia in the 1920s. We know that there were other women in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., other Black women who graduated from law school but could not keep a legal practice on their own, who went into business with their lawyer husbands, and together were able to forge paths in terms of an independent legal practice. It's worth noting that when Lutie graduated from law school in 1897, she was not the first Black woman to graduate from law school. The first Black woman to graduate from law school was Charlotte Ray, and Charlotte Ray had graduated from Howard in the 1870s. By the time Lutie Lytle goes to law school in the 1890s, nobody remembers Charlotte Ray. Charlotte Ray, who had graduated in the 1870s, less than a decade after emancipation, in Washington, D.C., hoping to establish an actual law practice in the 1870s in Washington, D.C., she can't do it. Nobody will give her cases. Nobody will be a mentor to her. No one will go into practice with her. So Charlotte Ray then goes on to be a school teacher, having sort of blazed this trail for Black women lawyers in the 1870s. She can't use the education that she has acquired at Howard. When Lutie comes along 20 plus years later, the exact same thing is happening. These black women who have the credentials, who have the education, and most importantly, who have the will, are unable to pursue legal practice because people won't go into business with them and because people won't hire them on to represent them. So Lutie was in New York City active. She wasn't active in the New York City Bar Association. We think because the New York City Bar Association had some restrictive policies around black lawyers joining its ranks. We think she may have been active in small informal professional associations of lawyers in the city. We know that she was very active with political and community organizations in New York City. So after her husband, Mr. Cohen, passed away in, I think, maybe early 19 teens, Lutie maintains the practice for a few years. During that time, she's active in state and local Republican politics. So Lutie Lytle is a Republican, the party of Lincoln, in the early 19 teens. She is active in all these clubs. So there's something called the Sunrise Club, and there are various women's clubs and clubs named after flowers, and she's in all of these clubs. And how do we know this? We know because even though the clubs themselves don't necessarily have archives, Lutie Lytle, because of her position and her stature, she often hosted these groups either as a member, or the groups hosted her as a speaker. So we know that Lutie either was giving oratory in front of these groups, or she was hosting the groups in her own home. One of the most interesting things that I found when researching Lutie's life is that Lutie Lytle was associated with the United Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. This is an organization that was founded by Marcus Garvey in New York City. UNEA, as the United Negro Improvement Association was known, UNEA and Garvey had a Back to Africa mission. And the mission was not to repatriate necessarily, but to look to Africa for Black Americans, for Black Caribbeans, for Blacks in South America, to look to Africa for encouragement, for investment opportunities, to look to the Black diaspora for a different kind of freedom and a different kind of citizenship. Lutie Lytle, on her own, becomes associated with UNEA when Marcus Garvey himself is sort of being pushed out. So this is interesting. So we see that Lutie gets elected to some position of leadership, an international position of leadership in one of the UNEA spinoff groups. We know that she was very interested in sort of what citizenship could mean. We know that because she talked about citizenship as a teenager. I mean, how many 19-year-olds are out talking about what citizenship means to them? Lutie Lytle was doing that. And even as she grew more mature in her profession and in her life, she was still thinking, what is citizenship? And what does that mean to me? And what does that mean to my people? And how can I use my talent and my skill to actually help us realize that goal? The last reference that I have been able to find to Lutie Lytle in any press is in the early 1940s, so I think 1941. We learned recently, just last year, that Lutie passed away in 1955, November 1955, in New York City. I think that she may have died poor, and this is the great tragedy of her life, having worked to send herself to law school, having traveled around looking for people to go into practice with her, having married a lawyer, building a practice with him, seeing him pass away suddenly, working in New York City with community organizations, with UNEA, with political organizations, being an active Black Republican in the early 20th century political scene in New York City. We see that in the 1940s, late 1930s, 1940s, Lutie was sued by Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn for unpaid medical bills. And it could very well be the case that Lutie Lytle was rendered insolvent because of a medical crisis. When she died, there was no reference to her anywhere. She has no obituary published anywhere. We know that we've searched to find her final resting place. We can't find her. So one of the tasks, one of my goals for even sharing her story here is the hope that the AALS, that ABA, that the legions of women who have come behind her into the legal academy see the value in her story and do what we can to identify her final resting place and give her the send-off that she deserves. I wish people knew that Lutie was not she was no wallflower. She spoke clearly, and it didn't matter to her if people weren't listening. She knew what her voice was. And one of the things that I think often we don't talk enough to our students about, especially our women students, is find your voice. You don't have to assume anybody else's voice. You can actually thrive in your own voice. Speak your own truth, and let's see what we can do together.